The man I was supposed to marry, the man I'd loved with every fiber of my being for 3 years, tightened the last knot around my wrist and smiled. The man I was supposed to marry, the man I'd loved with every fiber of my being for 3 years, tightened the last knot around my wrist and smiled. It wasn't his usual smile, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made my stomach do a little flip. No, this was a different smile. It was cold, practiced, like a salesman closing a deal he knows is a scam. His name was Mark, and he was my entire world. Or at least, I thought he was. Perfect, he said, his voice a low murmur that was almost lost to the rustling of the autumn leaves around us. He stepped back to admire his work. I was bound tightly to an old gnarled oak tree deep in the state forest, miles from any trail. The rough bark dug into my back through my thin hiking jacket, and the coarse rope was already starting to chafe my skin raw. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This had to be a joke. A sick, twisted, horrifying joke. "Mark, stop it. This isn't funny," I pleaded, my voice trembling so hard I could barely form the words. "Untie me, now." He just shook his head, that chilling smile never leaving his face. "Oh, Clara," he sighed, a sound of mock disappointment. "You always were a little too trusting. It's one of the things I loved about you." He used the past tense. Loved. The word hit me like a physical blow. Just an hour ago, he'd woken me up with kisses and a flask of hot coffee, telling me he had a surprise. A romantic sunrise hike to the spot where we'd had our second date, the place he first told me he loved me. I'd been so excited, so wrapped up in the fairy tale, that I didn't notice the coil of rope in the bottom of his backpack. I didn't question why we were driving so far off the main road, or why he insisted we leave our phones in the car to unplug and just be with each other. I was an idiot. A blind, trusting idiot. He'd been my rock, especially these last few months. After my grandfather passed away, I was a wreck. Grandpa Robert wasn't just my grandfather. He was the man who raised me after my parents died. He was everything. Mark was the one who held me while I cried, who handled the funeral arrangements, who listened for hours as I told him stories about Grandpa. He was so supportive when I, as the sole heir and an estate lawyer myself, had to begin the process of executing the will. "Don't you worry about a thing, baby," he'd said, stroking my hair. "We'll get through this together. This inheritance, it's just a tool. It'll let us build the life we've always dreamed of." Now, standing in front of me in the dim pre-dawn light, he looked like a complete stranger. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by an unnerving, calculating emptiness. "Why?" I whispered, the single word tearing at my throat. "Mark, why are you doing this?" He crouched down in front of me, his face just inches from mine. His breath smelled like the coffee he'd so lovingly made for me. "Because of him," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your precious grandfather, the man who looked right through me every time I saw him, the man who told you, on his deathbed no less, to be careful with me." He spat the words out like they were poison. He never thought I was good enough for his little princess. And he was right. I'm not good enough. I'm so much better. He reached out and traced a line down my cheek with his thumb. I flinched away from his touch, a touch that had once brought me so much comfort and now felt like a brand. His money, Clara. That's the real prize. And the will is very specific. If the sole beneficiary is declared missing for 72 hours, the estate passes to the next of kin, or, in the absence of any other kin— He paused, letting the implication hang in the cold air. "It passes to the designated emergency contact and fiancé. Funny how that works out, isn't it?" My blood ran cold. He had planned this. Every supportive word, every comforting touch. It was all part of an elaborate, monstrous plan. He wasn't just leaving me here. He was leaving me here to die, so he could steal the legacy my grandfather had left for me. "You won't get away with this," I hissed, newfound anger momentarily eclipsing the terror. "They'll find you." He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed through the silent woods. "Find me? Clara, by the time anyone even thinks to look for you out here, I'll be long gone. I'll be the grieving fiancé, the man who lost everything. People will feel sorry for me. They'll help me, and I'll have all the resources I need to start a new life, a life I deserve." He stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees. He looked down at me, one last time, with an expression of pure, unadulterated indifference. It was the look you'd give an insect before you crushed it. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say anything else. He just turned and walked away, his footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the immense, terrifying silence of the forest. And then I was alone. The next 2 days were a blur of terror, pain, and a primal will to survive I never knew I possessed. I screamed until my throat was raw. I pulled at the ropes until my wrists were bloody and torn. Night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep cold and the sounds of unseen animals moving in the darkness around me. I thought about my grandfather, about his strength, and I refused to let this be how my story ended. On the second day, through a haze of dehydration and exhaustion, I noticed the rope around my right wrist had a slight fray. It was my only hope. I twisted and pulled, ignoring the searing pain, using a sharp piece of bark from the tree to saw at the single weak thread. For hours, I worked at it, my fingers numb, my vision blurring. Finally, with a snap that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, the rope gave way. It took me another hour to untie the rest of the knots with one hand. I stumbled through the woods, disoriented and weak, following the faint path Mark had made. I walked for what felt like an eternity until I finally collapsed onto the edge of a deserted service road. A logging truck found me an hour later. The driver thought I was a ghost. The police, the hospital, the endless questions. It was all a nightmare. Mark had vanished. His apartment was cleared out. He had a fake passport and a new identity waiting, the police said. He was a professional, a predator who had seen a target and played the long game. They put out a bulletin for his arrest, but they weren't optimistic. He could be anywhere in the world by now. 3 days after my rescue, I forced myself to go back to my office. I needed normalcy. I needed to feel in control of something, anything. My office, with its neat files and the quiet hum of the air conditioning, was my sanctuary. I sat at my large mahogany desk, my grandfather's desk, and tried to focus on a probate document, but the words just swam in front of my eyes. My assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Clara, there's a gentleman here to see you, a Mr. Davies. He says it's regarding the Robert Sterling estate." My heart skipped a beat. A creditor, maybe? A forgotten business associate of Grandpa's? "Send him in, Susan," I said, my voice hoarse. The door to my office swung open, and my world stopped. It was him. It was Mark. He wasn't on the run. He wasn't in another country. He was standing right there, not 10 feet away from me. He wore an expensive-looking tailored suit I'd never seen before. His hair was perfectly styled, and on his face was that same cold, confident smile I'd seen in the woods. He looked at me, tied to my grandfather's chair in my own office, and he showed no fear, no remorse. He looked at me as if I were a minor obstacle. He closed the door gently behind him, the click echoing in the silent room. He walked forward, stopping at the edge of my desk, and placed a pristine leather briefcase on its polished surface. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I believe you have something that belongs to me. According to the law, you've been missing for over 72 hours. I'm here to claim my inheritance." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the frantic, hammering pulse in my own ears. It felt like the world had tilted on its axis, sending all the air rushing out of the room. My brain simply couldn't process it. The man who had left me to die of exposure, whose indifferent face was seared into my memory as my last sight on earth, was now standing before me as if he were here for a routine client meeting. My fingers, still tender and wrapped in light bandages, curled into a fist on the surface of my grandfather's desk. The pain was a grounding sensation, a sharp reminder that this was real. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, just a split-second widening of his eyes before the mask of cool confidence snapped back into place. He hadn't expected me to be here. Of course he hadn't. He expected an empty office, a grieving staff, and a clear path to his prize. My survival was an inconvenient wrinkle in his otherwise perfect plan. "Clara," he said again, his voice layered with a sickening, feigned concern. "My God, you're here. You're safe." He took a step forward, his hands slightly outstretched as if he were approaching a startled animal. The movement broke my paralysis. A volcano of rage, hot and violent, erupted from the pit of my stomach. "Get out!" I rasped, my voice a broken thing. "Get out!" He stopped, his expression shifting to one of hurt confusion. It was a masterful performance. "Baby, what's wrong? I've been going out of my mind with worry. I came back from our hike. You were gone. I searched for hours. I called the police, the park rangers. I filed a missing persons report. I haven't slept in 3 days." He was twisting it. He was building his own narrative, brick by sickening brick, right in front of my eyes. The audacity of it was breathtaking. You tied me to a tree," I said, the words feeling insane even as I spoke them. "You left me in the woods to die." Mark shook his head slowly, a look of profound sadness on his face. "Clara, sweetheart, what are you talking about? We went for a hike. You were upset, still grieving over Robert. You said you needed some time alone to walk by yourself. I went back to the car to wait. When you didn't come back, I panicked." He gestured to his immaculate suit. "I came here today to speak with your partners, to start the legal process. I thought it was the only way to protect the estate until you were found." He was going to gaslight me. He was going to stand there in the heart of my professional life and paint me as a hysterical, unstable woman spiraling from grief. He would make my truth sound like the ravings of a lunatic. Every ounce of my legal training screamed at me to be calm, to be methodical, but the raw, primal terror he'd inflicted on me was clawing its way up my throat. "You're a monster," I whispered, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. "The police have a warrant for your arrest. I told them everything." A genuine, amused smile touched his lips. "Oh, I know. I spoke with a Detective Miller this morning. Very nice man. I explained the situation. How distraught you've been. How you've been having episodes, forgetting things, saying things that didn't quite make sense. He was very understanding, especially when I showed him the note you left." The note?" I stammered, my mind racing. "What note?" "I didn't leave a note." He clicked open his briefcase with a soft snick. He pulled out a single piece of paper, sealed in a clear plastic evidence bag. He laid it on the desk between us. It was my personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with my initial embossed at the top, and it was covered in my handwriting, or a flawless, perfect forgery of it. My eyes scanned the familiar loops and curves of the letters, forming words that felt like a violation. It was a suicide note. It spoke of unbearable grief, of not being able to go on without my grandfather, of needing to disappear into the woods to be with him again. It was rambling, poetic, and utterly convincing. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. "I found it on your pillow when I got back to the apartment," Mark said, his voice dripping with synthetic sorrow. "I didn't want to believe it. I hid it. I was trying to protect you, your memory, but when the police started asking questions, I had to show them. For your own good. He wasn't just trying to steal my inheritance anymore. He was trying to steal my sanity, my credibility, my very identity. He had spent years studying me, learning my handwriting, my turns of phrase, my deepest fears. He had built this cage for me long before he'd found that tree in the woods. "That's not mine," I said, my voice cold and steady now. The shock was burning off, replaced by an icy resolve. This was no longer my fiancé. This was an opponent, and I was on my home turf. "You forged that." "Clara," he sighed, as if explaining something to a difficult child. "Listen to yourself. It's okay. You've been through a trauma. The doctors at the hospital said you were severely dehydrated, suffering from exposure. It can cause hallucinations, paranoia. We'll get you help, the best help my money can buy." "Your money?" The words dripped with venom. "You will not see 1 cent of my grandfather's money." He leaned forward, his palms flat on the desk, his face just a few feet from mine. The charming mask fell away, and for a second I saw the man from the woods again, the cold, empty predator. "That's where you're wrong," he whispered, his voice a low, menacing threat. "I've already filed the preliminary probate paperwork. I have your letter. I have a missing persons report that I filed 24 hours before you were found. I have witnesses who can attest to your erratic behavior since your grandfather's death." He smiled that terrible dead smile. "You come out of the woods, raving about being tied to a tree after leaving a suicide note? Who do you think they're going to believe, Clara? A grieving, hysterical woman with a history of episodes, or the devoted fiancé who's been moving heaven and earth to find her? He straightened up, adjusting his tie. He picked up the plastic-bagged letter and slid it back into his briefcase. You're unwell, and an unwell person can't be in charge of a multi-million-dollar estate. The court will see that. A conservatorship will be in order, and I, he said, tapping the briefcase, am the logical choice to oversee it. He turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob. My mind was spinning, trying to find a move, a counter-move, anything. He had thought of everything. He had twisted the narrative so completely that the truth itself had become my biggest liability. He paused at the door and looked back at me, a final, pitying look on his face. You know, I already had a brief chat with Mr. Abernathy, your senior partner. Showed him a copy of the letter. He's the one who let me up here, you know. He's waiting for you in the main conference room. He said they need to discuss your, immediate leave of absence. The click of the door closing behind Mark was like the sound of a vault being sealed. For a moment, I was entombed in the silence, the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me. Mr. Abernathy, my mentor. The man who had taken me under his wing right out of law school, who had seen something in me that reminded him of my grandfather, his old friend. Mark hadn't just poisoned the police against me. He had gone straight for the heart of my professional life, planting the seeds of doubt with the one person whose respect I valued most. Abernathy was waiting. For me. To discuss my leave of absence. Mark had boxed me in so perfectly it was almost elegant in its cruelty. Every direction I turned, he was already there, waiting with a new lie, a new deception. He had built a prison of perception around me, and my own truth was the key he'd thrown away. Rage, cold and pure, cut through the fog of shock. He thought he'd won. He thought I would crumble, that I'd retreat into the role of the hysterical victim he'd so carefully crafted for me. He underestimated me. He had studied my handwriting, my habits, my grief. But he had never understood my strength. He had never understood that I was my grandfather's granddaughter. I stood up, my legs steadier than I expected. I smoothed down my blouse, took a deep breath, and walked out of my office. The familiar hallway of Sterling, Abernathy, and Finch felt alien. The gazes of my colleagues, usually warm and friendly, now seemed filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Whispers died as I approached. My assistant, Susan, looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, as if I were a ghost. Mark's poison was already seeping into the foundations of my life. The door to the main conference room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Mr. Abernathy was standing by the large window overlooking the city, his back to me. He was a tall, imposing man, usually full of blustering energy, but today his shoulders were slumped. Two other senior partners, Michael Finch and Eleanor Vance, were seated at the long mahogany table. Their expressions were grim, their hands steepled in front of them. It felt less like a meeting and more like an intervention, or an inquisition. "Clara," Mr. Abernathy said, turning around. His voice was heavy with a sorrow that cut me deeper than any accusation. "Thank God you're safe. We've all been beside ourselves." "I'm fine, James," I said, using his first name, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "But we have a serious problem." "Indeed, we do," Michael Finch interjected, his tone clinical. He was the firm's pragmatist, all about numbers and liabilities. "Clara, we've seen the letter your fiancé provided. We've also spoken with Detective Miller. He's concerned about your mental state." "My fiancé," I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth, tied me to a tree and left me to die so he could steal my inheritance. The letter is a forgery, and he is a sociopath who has been playing all of us for years. I watched their faces as I spoke. I saw the flicker of doubt, the deep-seated desire to believe me, warring with the mountain of evidence Mark had so expertly constructed. Eleanor, who had always been a champion for me, looked torn. "A forgery?" Abernathy asked, his brow furrowed. "Clara, the handwriting is identical, and what he described, your grief. It's understandable that you would be unstable?" I finished for him, my voice sharp. "Not thinking clearly. Is that what he told you?" "He said he was worried," Eleanor said softly. "He seems utterly devastated, Clara. He presented a compelling picture. Of course he did. That was his gift. He was a master artist, and people's perceptions were his clay. I want a handwriting expert, I declared, looking each of them in the eye. I want you to pull every document I've ever signed, every note I've ever written. Compare them. There will be inconsistencies. There have to be. We can do that, Abernathy agreed slowly, but Clara, this process, it takes time. In the interim, given the circumstances and the potential for a police investigation into your disappearance and Mark's claims, we think it's best if you take a step back. A leave of absence, I stated, the words tasting like defeat. Just until this is cleared up, he said, his tone pleading, for your own good, to rest, to recover from your ordeal. My ordeal. They didn't even know what my ordeal truly was. They thought it was grief and a mental break. They didn't understand that I was at war. And what about the Sterling estate? I asked, my voice dangerously low. While I'm on my leave of absence, who will be handling my grandfather's probate? Mark has already filed paperwork. He's trying to have me declared incompetent and institute a conservatorship. A heavy silence fell over the room. They had already considered this. Legally, as your fiancé and emergency contact, with your apparent instability. He has a strong claim, Michael said reluctantly. We would, of course, fight it, but it would be a difficult, public, and very messy battle. This was Mark's checkmate. He had neutralized me both personally and professionally. While I was sidelined fighting to prove my own sanity, he would use the full power of the legal system, my legal system, to bleed my inheritance dry. He would win by default. No, I said, a sudden clarity washing over me. Arguing was pointless. They were lawyers. They needed evidence, not emotional testimony. I had to give them something they couldn't ignore. I will not be taking a leave of absence, and I will be handling my grandfather's estate myself, effective immediately. Abernathy opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. Grandpa Robert was a brilliant man, but he was also paranoid. He didn't trust banks, he didn't trust the stock market, and he certainly didn't trust smooth-talking young men who suddenly took an interest in his heiress granddaughter. I walked over to the bookshelf that lined one entire wall of the conference room, filled with leather-bound legal texts. I ran my fingers along the spines until I found it, a worn dark blue copy of The Law of Trusts and Trustees, 1958 edition. My grandfather had given it to Abernathy when he first made partner. I pulled it from the shelf. It was heavier than it should have been. My grandfather believed in tangible assets, I said, turning back to face them. He believed in things you could hold in your hand. I placed the book on the table with a heavy thud. With trembling fingers, I found the small, almost invisible seam along the edge of the cover and pried it open. The front cover was hollowed out. Nestled inside, protected by a velvet lining, wasn't a key or a document. It was a small, state-of-the-art digital voice recorder, no bigger than my thumb. "What is that?" Eleanor whispered. "It's leverage," I said, my heart pounding. I picked up the recorder. There was a tiny, blinking red light on the side, indicating it had power. The last time Mark visited my grandfather in the hospital, 2 days before he died, Grandpa insisted I leave them alone to talk. He said he wanted to give Mark his blessing. I thought it was strange at the time. Grandpa never liked him. I looked at the stunned faces of my partners. My grandfather recorded their conversation. I pressed the small play button. The room was silent for a beat, and then a weak, raspy voice filled the air. It was my grandfather, his voice frail but clear. "So, you think you've got it all figured out, don't you, son? You think you've pulled the wool over my Clara's eyes? You think you're going to get your hands on my money?" A second voice joined in, smooth and confident. It was unmistakably Mark's. "With all due respect, Robert, I love your granddaughter. The money is just a bonus, a way for us to build a future." "Don't you lie to me, boy," Grandpa's voice rasped. "I've met snakes like you my whole life. You reek of ambition. But let me tell you something. You'll never see a dime. I've made sure of it. I put a little insurance policy in my will, a little clause you won't see coming." There was a pause, and then Mark's voice, no longer smooth but cold and sharp with irritation. "What are you talking about? What clause?" My grandfather coughed, a racking sound, and then he laughed, a faint wheezing laugh that was pure triumph. "You'll see. You'll see when it's too late. Now get out of my sight." The recording ended. I looked up at Abernathy. The color had drained from his face. "A clause?" he breathed. "What clause? I drafted the will with him. There's no special clause." "Isn't there, James?" I asked softly. "Think back. The final draft. The day before he went into the hospital for the last time. He came in alone, didn't he? He said he needed to make one final minor amendment. He insisted on typing it himself on your private terminal so no one else would see it before it was sealed." Abernathy's eyes widened in dawning comprehension. He remembered. "He told me it was just a sentimental addition about his coin collection," he whispered, horrified. "I didn't even read it closely. I just notarized it and sealed it." "I think," I said, my voice ringing with a newfound certainty, "that we need to unseal my grandfather's will right now." The walk to the firm's vault felt like a procession. Mr. Abernathy led the way, his usual confident stride replaced by a hurried, anxious shuffle. Michael and Eleanor followed, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning respect. I walked behind them, the small voice recorder clutched in my hand like a talisman. The recording hadn't just vindicated me in their eyes, it had resurrected my grandfather. For a few brief moments, his voice had filled that room, sharp, cunning, and 2 steps ahead of everyone, even from the grave. He hadn't just been protecting his fortune. He had been protecting me. The thought brought a lump to my throat. The vault was in the sub-basement, a relic from the firm's early days with a massive steel door and a complex series of tumblers. Abernathy's hands trembled slightly as he spun the dial, the soft clicks echoing in the cool, dry air. With a heavy groan, the door swung inward, revealing rows upon rows of safe deposit boxes, each holding the final wishes and deepest secrets of the city's elite. He led us to a box marked Sterling R, and used his master key, along with mine, to open it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single thick vellum envelope, sealed with a dollop of dark red wax bearing my grandfather's signet ring, a roaring lion. This was it. The document Mark was willing to kill for. We returned to the conference room, the sealed will placed in the center of the vast mahogany table, like a sacred artifact. The air was thick with anticipation. Abernathy took a deep breath and used a silver letter opener to carefully slice through the wax seal. He slid the document out, his eyes scanning the first page, then the second, his brow furrowed in concentration. Standard bequests, charitable donations. Everything seems to be in order as we drafted it, he murmured, flipping through the pages. It all passes to you, Clara, as the sole heir. Keep reading, James, I urged, my heart hammering against my ribs. Look for the amendment, the part about the coin collection. He found it on the penultimate page, a single dense paragraph typed in a slightly different font, the font from his private terminal. His eyes widened as he read. He read it once, then again, his lips moving silently. Finally, he looked up, his face pale with shock. "My God," he whispered. He slid the document across the table to me. I read the clause my grandfather had so cleverly hidden. It was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering, disguised as the sentimental ramblings of an old man. It began by referencing his prized collection of Roman coins, specifically the Ides of March denarius, a coin minted to celebrate the assassination of Julius Caesar. The coin was a symbol of betrayal. The clause stated, "In the event of my death, should my beloved granddaughter Clara Sterling enter into a marriage that is subsequently dissolved for any reason, including but not limited to divorce, annulment, or the death of her spouse, within the first 5 years following my demise, the entirety of the Sterling estate and all its holdings shall be immediately and irrevocably transferred." My breath caught in my throat. Transferred? To whom? I read on. Transferred not to a person, but into a blind trust, a trust with a single, unalterable directive, to fund and establish the Robert Sterling Memorial Shelter for Abused Women, to be managed by a board of directors appointed by the City Council. My granddaughter shall have no access to the principal funds, though she may be granted a modest living stipend at the board's discretion, provided she is not found to be at fault for the dissolution of her marriage. It was brilliant. Utterly, ruthlessly brilliant. My grandfather had built a firewall around his legacy. If Mark married me and then tried to get rid of me, either by divorcing me or, worse, he would end up with nothing. Less than nothing. The entire fortune would vanish into a charitable trust he could never touch. He wouldn't even be left with a grieving, wealthy widow. He'd be left with a woman with a modest stipend and a massive legal headache. The clause was designed to make me worthless to him. It was a poison pill. He knew, I breathed, a tear tracing a path down my cheek. All this time, he knew what Mark was. He laid a perfect trap, Michael Finch said, a note of pure professional admiration in his voice. If your fiancé marries you, he gets nothing. If he kills you after you're married, he gets nothing. The only way for him to inherit is if you die before the wedding, while you're still the sole beneficiary and he's the designated fiancé, which is exactly what he tried to do. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place. Mark's sudden proposal a month after my grandfather's diagnosis, his insistence on a quick wedding. It all made sense. But then, a chilling realization dawned on me. He doesn't know about this clause, I said, looking around the table. Abernathy didn't know. I didn't know. He thinks the will is straightforward. He thinks his plan to have me declared incompetent and take control through a conservatorship will still work. He will fight it, Eleanor said, her voice firm. He has your suicide note. He's laid the groundwork to discredit you. When we present this in probate court, his lawyers will argue that you forged this clause after the fact, trying to cut him out. And it's our word against his, Abernathy finished grimly. He'll paint us as corrupt lawyers trying to protect our firm's interests, and a client who is clearly mentally unstable. The brief moment of triumph evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of the fight ahead. Mark was still a threat. He was a cornered animal now, and that made him even more dangerous. He had built a powerful narrative, and we had just one secret clause to counter it with. It would be a brutal, public battle of credibility. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling city below. My grandfather had given me a shield, but I still needed a sword. I needed more than just a defensive strategy. I needed to go on the offensive. I needed to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt, not only that I was sane, but that Mark was the monster I knew him to be. But how? He was a ghost. His entire identity was a fabrication. The police were looking for a man who probably didn't even exist. He made a mistake, I said softly, thinking aloud. He got greedy. He could have just disappeared after he left me in the woods, waited for the news to break. But he couldn't wait. He had to walk into my office, to put his plan into motion immediately. That's his weakness, arrogance, impatience. I turned back to face my partners. He thinks he has complete control of the narrative. He thinks I'm isolated and terrified. He's going to get comfortable, and when he does, he's going to get sloppy. My mind was racing, connecting disparate threads, fragments of conversations, small details from the 3 years we'd been together. There had to be something, some crack in the facade. The suit, I said suddenly. What suit? Abernathy asked. The suit he was wearing today. It was new, expensive, tailored. He wouldn't have bought that off the rack. He's vain. He would have gone to a high-end tailor, someone who keeps records. Clara, there are hundreds of tailors in this city, Michael said reasonably. Yes, I agreed, but how did he pay for it? The police have frozen the joint account he shared with me. They've flagged his credit cards. He's supposed to be a man on the run, with limited assets. But he walked in here today looking like $1 million. So where is he getting his money? My own question hung in the air, sparking a memory. A conversation from months ago. Mark complaining about the hassle of international wire transfers for his consulting business. He'd mentioned a specific service he used, one that specialized in discrete offshore accounts and untraceable transactions. He'd named it, bragging about its exclusivity. I had thought it was just him showing off, but now... Eleanor, I said, my voice sharp with urgency, get your best financial investigator on the phone. I have a name for him, the Minerva Group. Eleanor's eyes lit up with understanding as she reached for her phone. If we could trace his money, we could find him. We could unravel his entire network. Just then, my own phone, sitting on the conference table, buzzed. I glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Hello? Is this Clara Sterling?" a woman's voice asked. It was hesitant, nervous. "Yes." "Who is this?" There was a shaky breath on the other end of the line. "My name is Sarah. You don't know me, but I think I was married to the man you call Mark." The name, Sarah, hung in the air, instantly silencing the conference room. Eleanor paused, her phone halfway to her ear. Abernathy stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. A wife? Mark had a wife? No, she'd used the past tense. Was married. The implications were dizzying. My entire 3-year relationship, the engagement, the shared dreams. It was all a lie built on top of another, older lie. "Sarah," I said, my voice carefully neutral, though my heart was doing a frantic drum solo against my ribs. "Where are you?" I'm in a town you've probably never heard of in Oregon," she said, her voice small and laced with fear. "I saw his picture. It was on a national news feed, an alert for a person of interest in the disappearance of a prominent lawyer. His name was Mark, but the picture... That's my husband, or my ex-husband. His name is Julian Croft. He disappeared 5 years ago." Julian Croft. The name felt foreign, but the story was sickeningly familiar. "What happened, Sarah?" I asked, my knuckles white as I gripped the phone. Her story tumbled out in a rush of pain and long suppressed anger. Julian had been charming, attentive, the man of her dreams. He'd swept her off her feet. They were married for 2 years. Her parents had passed away a year into their marriage, leaving her a substantial inheritance, a sprawling farm, equipment, and a healthy portfolio. 6 months later, Julian vanished. He cleared out their bank accounts, maxed out her credit cards, and disappeared from the face of the earth, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a note that framed her for insurance fraud. It had taken her years to clear her name and salvage what was left of her family's legacy. "The police couldn't find him," she said, her voice cracking. "They said he was a ghost, a professional. He targets women, I see that now. Women who are alone, who are vulnerable, who have something he wants." "Did he ever mention the Minerva Group?" I asked, the name feeling electric on my tongue. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Yes, how did you know? He said it was for his investments. He made me sign papers, give him power of attorney to manage my portfolio through them. That's how he liquidated everything so fast." "Sarah," I said, a plan forming, cold and sharp in my mind. "He's not a ghost anymore. He's here, and I'm going to need your help to catch him." The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of calculated action. While Eleanor's investigator used the information from Sarah to tear into the Minerva Group's shadowy network, I focused on setting the stage. Sarah, brave and furious, agreed to fly in immediately. Abernathy, now fully on my side, used his considerable influence to pull strings with the police department, getting Detective Miller reassigned and replaced with a sharp, no-nonsense detective named Valenti, who was willing to listen. We had the will. We had the recording. And now, we had Sarah. We had a pattern. But we needed the final, irrefutable proof. We needed to catch him in his own trap. The plan was simple, and that was its beauty. Mark, or Julian, was arrogant. He believed I was isolated and crumbling. He believed his narrative was the only one that mattered. So I was going to give him the scene he expected. 2 days later, I sat alone in the same conference room, the city lights twinkling in the twilight beyond the large windows. The office was empty, the cleaning crew long gone. I had sent Mark a single, simple text message from my phone. "You were right. I'm not well. I can't fight you. Let's just talk." It was the bait, and I knew his ego wouldn't let him refuse. At precisely 9 p.m., the door opened. It was him. He was wearing another impeccable suit, a look of smug triumph on his face. He had won. He was just here to survey his prize. "Clara," he said, his voice oozing false sympathy, "I'm so glad you came to your senses. This is for the best. You'll see." "Sit down, Mark," I said, my voice flat. I gestured to the chair opposite me at the long table. He sat leaning back with a proprietary air, as if he already owned the place. "So, you're ready to cooperate with the conservatorship? It will be painless, I promise. I'll make sure you're very comfortable." "I have a question for you first," I said, leaning forward, "before I sign anything. It's about my grandfather's will. There's a clause about his coin collection." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not recognition, but greed. He thought I was about to reveal a hidden asset. "Oh?" he said, his interest piqued. "Go on." I slid a copy of the final page of the will across the table. "Read it." I watched him as his eyes scanned the paragraph. I watched the confident smirk slowly dissolve. I watched his face pale, then flush with a dark mottled red as the meaning of the words sank in. The trap my grandfather had set years ago finally snapped shut. "This is a fake," he hissed, shoving the paper back at me. "This is a forgery. You had your crooked lawyers draft this up after the fact." "Is it?" I asked calmly. "Or is it the reason you couldn't just marry me and wait? Is it the reason your only option was to make sure I died before the wedding? So you could inherit as my fiancé before this clause ever came into effect?" He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The mask was gone. This was the man from the woods, his face contorted with pure, unrestrained fury. "You delusional bitch! You left a suicide note! You're insane! Everyone knows it!" "Are you talking about this note?" a voice asked from the doorway. Mark spun around. Detective Valenti stood there holding the plastic-bagged letter, and next to her, looking small but resolute, was Sarah. Mark's face went completely white. He stared at Sarah as if he'd seen a ghost, his mind unable to compute her presence in this room, in this life he had built. "Hello, Julian," Sarah said, her voice shaking but strong. "It's been a long time." He was speechless, cornered. The walls of his carefully constructed world were crashing down around him. "We know all about the Minerva Group, Mr. Croft," Detective Valenti said, her voice like ice. "We know about the accounts in the Caymans. We know how you funneled Sarah's inheritance through them. And we've been tracking the funds you've been using to pay for your fancy suits. Funds from an account belonging to a widow in Arizona you swindled 2 years ago. We have a pattern. A very clear, very ugly pattern." Mark looked from the detective to Sarah to me. His eyes were wild, darting around for an escape that wasn't there. "This is all her," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She's the liar. She's the one who's unstable." "Then you won't mind giving us a handwriting sample, will you?" Valenti asked, holding up a pen and a pad. "Just to clear your name. Write this down for me. I can't go on without him. I need to be in the woods to be with him again." He stared at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. It was the final perfect checkmate. He could refuse, which was an admission of guilt. Or he could write it, and the world's best forensic analysts would tear his forgery apart. He had nowhere left to run. He let out a strangled, inhuman roar of frustration and lunged, not at the detective, but at me. It was a last desperate act of violence. But I was ready. I brought my knee up hard, and 2 plainclothes officers who had been waiting in the adjoining office burst through the door, tackling him to the ground before he could even touch me. As they hauled him away, sputtering threats and denials, my eyes met Sarah's across the room. We were 2 strangers from different lives, different worlds, bound together by the same man's cruelty. But in her eyes, I didn't see a victim. I saw a survivor. And I knew she saw the same in me. The legal battles that followed were messy, but with Mark, Julian, in custody and his financial empire exposed, his credibility was shattered. The will was probated as my grandfather intended. Mark was facing a litany of federal charges that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. A few weeks later, I stood with Sarah on the steps of the courthouse. The first board meeting for the Robert Sterling Memorial Shelter for Abused Women was scheduled for the following month. I had asked Sarah to be a founding member. "He thought we were weak," she said, looking up at the sky, "because we loved him, because we trusted him." "He was wrong," I said, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. "He thought he was taking everything from us, but he can't take our strength. He can't take our future." My grandfather had left me more than just money. He'd left me a mission, and Mark, in his infinite arrogance, had left me something too, a fierce, unshakable understanding of my own resilience. He had tied me to a tree, but he had untied a part of me I never knew was bound. And now I was finally, truly free.